Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session on Deixix. My name is Chris Donnelly, and I'll be chairing the session with the help of Marion Dale and Mary Burke. First up, we have Guillaume Jacques and Aimee Lahaussois and their talk, Elevational Deixix in the Kiranti verb.
Hi, so what I'm going to do is share the screen. Am I able to do that, or do you need to allow special hosting?
I can. You should have permission to share screen. Let me know if you can't.
Can anyone see anything?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yep. Yes, looks
great. All right, great. What this means is that I can't see you guys now, but hopefully Guillaume is still out there. So for practical purposes, Guillaume and I decided that because we're in different places, I'm going to give the talk and he's going to be around to answer any questions, and we'll just see how this goes, because otherwise we'd have to stop the share partway and switch it to another computer. So Guillaume is out there somewhere. Hopefully he's waving so everyone sees who he is. All right, and we're very pleased to be here in this unusual form. Now I need to see if I can switch. Yes. All right. So we're going to tell you about elevational deixis in Kiranti with a little bit of a focus on the verb. And so a couple of things need to be established first. And one of them is, what is elevational deixis? And so it's a way of coding elevation as a category. So identifying the location or the path by its elevation relative to a deictic center, which is part of the problem, the whole concept of deictic center. So this is a pervasive typological feature in Trans-Himalayan, as Mark Post has written about recently. It's also been described in individual Kiranti languages by a number of people, including Boyd Mikolovsky, who's somewhere in some of the images. And it's attested in all Kiranti languages being the group of 30-odd languages spoken in eastern Nepal. And it's encoded across a couple of different grammatical categories. And so we find it in locational adverbs, which we are going to be marking in green in the examples that you'll see. You find it on case markers, which will be marked in red, and on verbs, which will be blue in the examples. All right, so the first thing that we want to say, so one thing that I did forget to tell you is that it codes 3 different types of elevation: up or upwards, horizontal, and downwards. And we'll show you many examples of this, I hope. So the first thing that we see, you have this example from Kaling, and you see that there's both a green thing and a red thing. And what we find is that there's a phenomenon that we like to think of as elevational agreement, where the different categories that can express elevation tend to across a whole sentence. And so it looks like it's being echoed throughout a sentence. And so you see this in the green adverb and in the red case marker in this Kaling example. Sorry, I'm pointing at my screen. I realize it looks a little bit silly. In this second example, which is from Toulon, you should be seeing both a green and a blue, where it is, so the elevation is coded in the adverb here, ala, and then it's also in the motion verb, to bring up. And then as far as how it's coded on verbs, we've got on this slide and the next one, a set of 3 different verbs from Belhare, where you see that these cislocative verbs, so towards the deictic center, the first one is come up, the second one, uns, is come down, and the third one here is to come across. And in the first example, you can see that it was echoed across the adverb as well. All right, so what are we coding? So as I mentioned, there are 3 different levels: up, level, or horizontal, and then downward. These are levels that are determined on the basis of the topography, which is not surprising in this very mountainous part of the world. And so the nature of this coding is, for most of the languages, described as the coding of topographical, also called geomorphic, geophysical elevation. And I'll show you a slide that shows something a little bit different, but there's also this question of whether riverine direction, so upstream, downstream, is coded. And it's not particularly mentioned. Boyd mentions it for one of the languages as being coded the same way as the uphill downhill, but nobody else seems to mention this. Whereas in Gerongic languages, for example, it's a separate morpheme, which serves to do the riverine orientation. The example here that we have is one that we like quite a lot. So we've got a highland insect coming down, and we've got a lowland insect that come up, and they meet in the middle saying different things, but it shows how these are used in the same sentence. All right, the other thing that can happen is you can code not only topographical features, but you can also code vertical axis. And in all of the languages we found, except for this Limbu dialect that Boyd has described, so Boyd Mikolovsky somewhere among the little pictures, this is coded the same way in the different languages, except for Tamarkole Limbu, where you get an opposition in coding between vertical orientation on the one hand and this geomorphic, geophysical on the other hand. The example that you have here is one of the examples that we find with vertical axis being coded in the elevation, but coded in Kaling exactly the same way as the geomorphic. And so what you have here is an example of a bird coming down. And so we know it's not following the topography, but instead following a vertical axis. So you find vertical expressed in bird flight, weather with rain coming down, posture, so people standing up on their legs, for example, the position of stars. But for most of the languages, except for Limbu, with this particular variety of Limbu, it's coded with the same morphology. So we mentioned that motion verbs also are a place where this elevational distinctions can be coded. Interestingly, for almost all of the languages, it's only cislocative motion verbs that code the elevation. So the ones that are towards the deictic center will code elevation, and the ones away from the deictic center, except for two examples that we'll show you, do not. So this is rather peculiar. What we're showing you here is a four-part paradigm where you see the upwards, downwards, same level verbs, and we also decided that we should include the unspecified verbs. And these are an interesting category, but we feel that it's part of what makes up a whole paradigm that kind of, well, describes the entire space that you would be able to describe orientationally. So the things to notice here, the languages are organized more or less from the west to the east. So Hayu in the west, Limbu at the bottom in the east. The things to notice are that within the different columns, you can probably see some cognate sets. And then we've got this question of the unspecified verb. So the ones that are coding both elevation and motion are doing it together, and you can't substitute an unspecified verb, right? An unspecified cislocative verb, so a come that doesn't specify elevation, cannot simply be substituted for the other ones. If you are able to code elevation, you have to do it with the verb that does both elevation and cislocative motion. When do you use the unspecified verbs? Well, there are a couple of situations, such as when you don't know what the elevation is. Like many examples that we have of it are, where are you coming from, where the person can't determine elevation and therefore has to use this unspecified version. You find it in metaphors a lot, and we'll show you a couple of examples. But the main thing that we're trying to show you here is that we like to think of them as a four-part paradigm as opposed to a three-part paradigm, because you've got the ones that do both deixis and elevation, and we've got the three of them, but then the rest of the space is covered by this unspecified verb, and you can't simply exchange the unspecified one for the elevation coding ones. All right, however, in two languages, you get sets of translocative motion verbs, so away from the deictic center, and you get them in Belhare and Bantoa. And similar to what we saw for the cislocatives, you've got the upwards, downwards, same level, and an unspecified. There's something that we're calling here verbs of caused accompanied motion that we've called manipulation verbs elsewhere, that are essentially the transitive versions, the transitive equivalents of the intransitive motion verbs that you'd seen on the first slide. derived through an implicative derivation with the T suffix. This is fairly classic, and the only reason to show it to you is that you see the same pattern as we found with the cislocative verbs. All right, we also have elevation case markers. And so you see that this is a smaller set of languages than we had for the cislocative verbs. And that's because there are a couple of languages which do not have elevational case markers and instead have a kind of elevational or directional demonstrative, which is cognate with these and does not have this as a case marker. What you notice here is that the unspecified locative, and there is one in most of these languages, is not listed in this paradigm because in fact it can combine with these case markers. In fact, these are very rich in terms of their combinatorics, and they can combine with adverbs, demonstratives to give all sorts of detail about the orientation. But we don't feel that the unspecified locative markers belong in the paradigm in that they're also combining with these. All right, so I mentioned that we have this agreement phenomenon where you find, in many cases, the elevation encoded on a number of different word classes within the same sentences. But there are situations where we find what looks like a mismatch between the elevational coding, the different kinds of elevation coding across a sentence. And we've come up with a couple of reasons, 3 of them, that might explain how this comes about. Because these are very grammatical categories that people don't just get wrong. I mean, they know exactly what's going on, as far as I can tell, in terms of elevation across their landscape. So the first reason that we might find a mismatch in elevation coding across the same sentence, or say a couple of utterances, is that there's a very fluid deictic center of motion events. Another thing is that in certain particular situations, you're going to neutralize elevational or motional deixis. And then there's also the fact that you can sometimes omit allative marking, which is not very frequent in these languages, or ablative marking. And the result is that you confuse source and goal, and it looks like a mismatch in elevation. All right, so the sentence that you have here, if we look just at the translation, so the context for the sentence is we've got a man in the story whose father has just turned to stone and been left at a lower location. And the person comes back up to his village to gather up the clan members and then take them back to the location in order to deal with the stone father. And so what he says, what you can see here, is that there's some direct speech in here. Then I left him there and came back. All right, and so the reason that he's using came back, and this is in terms of how the deixis works in the center of deixis in this sentence, came back because we're within a direct speech situation. And so the conversation, the interlocutor is in fact the deictic center in this situation. But then a little lower within the same sentence, right? So he's coming up to his people. And then he says, oh, let us all go back down, except that what he uses is the cislocative verb. So in fact, it should be translated come down. So he's got come up in direct speech and come down when you go back to the main narrative. And that's because in fact, the deictic center for the overall story is down where the father is. And so you've got this fluidity, and we've got many examples of this where within the same sentence, the deictic center is going to be jumping around, making it look like something's not matching in terms of how the elevation or the deixis are figured out. In this example, we've got something which to us looks like neutralization of either the elevational or the motional part of these different elevation coding motion verbs. So the one we have here, you need the context obviously, there is a mother up in a tree and her children are at a lower elevation coming up to the base of the tree. And she hears them and she says, oh, well, so the mother knew that the children had come here. But the verb that's used, even though the children are going up in elevation, and so you would expect, in fact, a come up kind of verb, she has to use an unspecified verb because they're not meeting her elevation. They're in fact going to an intermediary elevation. And so in fact, elevation has been neutralized in this context, and it's the neutral verb, the unspecified verb that gets used. All right, then, so this is an example from Bantawa by Dornenbaugh, and it's elicited, and so maybe it's to be taken with a grain of salt, but it shows kind of the flip side of this neutralization situation that we were trying to describe on the previous slide. And so in an imagined situation where you've got Prem down below and Siam up top, so you've got the three different possible ways of expressing how Siam is addressing Prem, and he can essentially tell him, come up to me using the cislocative, sorry, what was that?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. Using the cislocative upward motion verb. He can also use the cislocative upward motion verb when he's saying, Prem, go up to Ram. So that's a little unusual, but because in fact, he's meeting the same elevation as Siam is on, you can still use that same verb. So this is another example of neutralization of one of the features that will be useful to us later on. All right, and then this is just a sentence where we've got what looks like a mismatch. We've got, I come up, low locative. And so, okay, what's going on? Well, it's because in this case, the ablative marker was simply omitted, which happens surprisingly frequently. And the way you know to interpret this as a source as opposed to a goal is simply because the elevation coding doesn't match. All right, so now we get to the verbs. And the thing that's interesting, so these are the translocative and cislocative verb sets, motion verb sets in Belhare, one of the two languages that had both. So what's interesting here is to try to figure out where these came from diachronically. So how do they fit into the larger picture? So we've got set A, which are Belhare's translocative verbs, and set B, just to choose neutral terms, which are the cislocative verbs in Belhare. But when you look at this slide, which is mostly the cislocative verbs in the different languages, because that's mostly what they have, except where you've got parentheses telling you that it's a translocative interpretation, you see that in fact what's happening is the Belhare current translocative verb is in fact cognate with the cislocative verbs in many of the other languages, except for the ones where we grayed it out where it's not cognate with it. So something a little funny is going on there. And the funny thing is that there's a shift in deixis for these verbs, right? From something that might have been cislocative to something which is now translocative. When you look at the group of cislocative motion verbs, so Belhare's set B, you see that this whole group of closely related languages together geographically are in fact cognate with each other, and all of them mean cislocative. So the question is, what might have happened there? And so I'm rushing on to the conclusion, but essentially what we have tried to show here is that elevation deixis is coded on verbs in all Kiranti languages, and the set A ones, which were Belhare's translocative verbs, are and the cislocative in every other language can probably be reconstructed to Proto-Kiranti. The set seems to be older than Kiranti because there's some cognates for downward and same level in Tangmi and Jurongik with the same meanings. So the synchronic shifts that I was trying to show you with the mother in the tree and Siam talking to Prem are a hint of how it would be possible to shift deixis from a situation of a cislocative verb or a neutral verb turning into something else, possibly explaining where the Belhare verbs came from. So set A being the cislocative verbs of, the translocative verb of Belhare and the cislocative of the other, was either originally cislocative in Proto-Kiranti or neutral. And then the smaller group that Belhare is part of either innovated set B verbs or that was it. Right, so innovated the set B verbs. Sorry, I hope I've managed to stay within the time, but essentially what we've tried to show in the survey is that the systems are typologically similar across the subgroup. When we have a tripartite system, they always code the same kinds of things. We need to, at least in our conception, include the unspecified motion verb in part of our paradigm, including the elevation coding ones. And this is potentially useful for reconstructing Proto-Kiranti and for subgrouping kinds of questions. Thank you. I hope the time's good.
Thank you very much. Time is excellent. We have 5 minutes-ish for questions. So you can propose a question in several ways. You can raise your hand, and one way to do that is click on participants. And at the bottom of that window, you should see a raise hand symbol, or you could also use the chat function to send a question as well.
Okay, did that come through?
No, but Jim, I'm guessing you have a question, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was interested, Aimee, to see this morpheme cut, which appears in lots of the languages. It looks to me like a direct cognate to a root gat, which means to run. And it's also a cognate, I think, to the second syllable of Lahaussois, the k part, which means to dance. So these things do move around.
All right. Well, I think if you have any, those kinds of questions are probably more relevant to Guillaume than to me, but that's an interesting one. Yeah. Especially is because that's the one that would be so cislocative in all the languages. So run. All right. There's some interesting things to figure out there.
Okay,
But thanks.
sure.
Guillaume, did you want to comment or not?
Well, I mean, the thing is that there is a cut, which is the translocative verb, for instance, kwan in calling, in something, and they also cut in the set B, which is actually a different verb. So the upwards one, which are not cognate. So which of the two would be the cognate of what you suggest? This one, the ka, I mean, comes from a g anyway, because in Kiranti you had a shift from g to k.
If anyone needs the slides back on, I can put the share back up. It's a little difficult trying to talk about any of this.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to talk about specific forms and etymologies just without the forms written. Yeah, indeed. But maybe
Agreed.
we can try in a chat.
We do have another question.
Yeah.
Nancy Caplow, you have a question?
Oh, yes. I enjoyed seeing this. I wasn't familiar with the use of the directional marking on verbs. I just posted in the chat a link to the proceedings, paper I had in the proceedings of the Himalayan Languages Symposium in 2007, where I look at directional terms in Tokpe-Gula Tibetan discourse. And you had mentioned riverine terms, and I actually referred there to hydrologic terms. From my previous career as a hydrogeologist, looking at up gradient, down gradient, and on contour. So up gradient kind of being the same as riverine, looking not just upwards, but anywhere where a drop of water would flow towards you. So capturing a larger area. And that was a long time ago, but I looked at adverbial functions and pronominal functions and some other ways that those are used. So you might be interested in taking a look at that.
Great. Yeah, it's very useful to have the exact reference here. And how convenient that you had, geology training in another life. Our pasts come back to haunt us. I'm needed in another. Okay, someone's leaving.
Okay, we have a minute for one more question. Stephen Morey has a question in the chat. Aimee, can you see the chat?
Are there cases of communities that have moved to flat riverine? Oh, that's interesting. I know nothing of this.
So if I can just briefly mention, amongst the Tangsa languages that I work, they have a go up verb and a go down, but now that they live in flat areas in India, it's upriver and downriver. Like there's no difference in the height, but that way is down and that way is up because that's the way the river works. So I'm just wondering whether such things have been observed in Nepal, if there are places that such communities move to, which are flat areas.
That's a really great question. One thing we did notice across the different sources that we looked at is how people were referring to Europe, right? Oh, come from Europe. And it was in fact very confused. There were some who said come across, some come up, come down. And it seemed to be doing much more than geophysical, than actual up and down, but rather sort of, you're a higher caste than I am, that kind of stuff getting blended into it as well, possibly airplanes as well. So, but that's a wonderful question to explore. Thank you for that.
That's very good.
Arthur, I'm sorry, I can't find the right button. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. The fourth column, the ta that had ta a lot. You know, you had the come up, come down, come across, and then you had ta, or a verb just meaning come. Except I think it's really a verb for arrive in most of those languages. And that's why it doesn't specify altitude, because it's arrive. The up and down is not really relevant. It's because it's punctual.
So the thing is, Boyd, that we also have verbs that do arrive, and they've got embedded into them ups and downs, like in Kali, to arrive up and to arrive down. And so is that the reason that for Hayu, we couldn't find anything there? Because in fact, you put it in your dictionary as to arrive?
Well, there's dong, yes, to arrive, right.
Oh, that solves a nice mystery.
And also Hayu turns out to have a verb to go up and to go down, which I somehow didn't, I translated them something like climb and descend, and didn't really associate them with as being mirrors of come up and come down. But well, maybe I'd have to look into that to see if they're really used exactly the same way, but I think that's probably correct. They're much less common, it seems to me.
Yeah, and so that's something that we found, is that some of the languages, it seemed that ones that looked kind of translocative were clearly so translocative going up, for example, cognate with other things that were glossed, ascend, climb. So there's a lot of funny stuff going on here, and it's difficult to untangle from the descriptions that we have. That's why we're really grateful that you are about a kilometer away from us in real life and can do this for real once this is over.
Yeah, we'll get together on that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's wrap up here so we have a minute or two to transition to the next talk. Everyone, thanks, Aimee, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.